those faculty position at the University of Washington, right? And you are now also professor at CMU. You did lots of very interesting things, very exciting, and I don't want to spend too much time explaining it, take too long, but she pioneered research on multilingual NLP, so she was one of the first people who actually started working on massively, maybe I can say, cross-lingual deep learning models. She worked and continues working on generation, on control generation, on summarization tasks. And another important topic in her group is NLP for social good. And I think what Yulia is planning to talk about today is kind of falls under this umbrella. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Yulia. Thank you again for giving this talk.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ivan, for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very excited to speak at this workshop. And yes, today I will talk about some research in my lab on computational ethics on NLP for social good. And I'm going to present some ideas on how to proactively prevent potential ethical and social issues in NLP systems, basically before biased language propagates into downstream NLP tools. So I start with some examples, and I need to apologize in advance. Some examples may seem offensive. These are real examples from data, but I will have some examples of microaggressions and hate speech. So I start with, here is one Twitter user, and here is their post. Do I look okay? And the response is, oh, you're so pretty. Is this conversation, does it look okay? Is this interaction positive or negative? It's probably a positive interaction. Here is another interaction by another user. So here is a post. Check out my new physics paper. And the response is, oh, why physics? You're so pretty. Is it a positive interaction or a negative interaction? So in this case, we don't know. It might be a microaggression and manifestation of some bias, objectification, but it might be just a joking conversation between two friends. So we really need to understand the social context to know if it's a positive interaction or a negative interaction. Here is yet another interaction by another user, and they ask, do I look okay? And here are possible responses that they can get. Oh, you're so pretty for your age. Or, oh, you're so pretty for a black girl, and so on. And in this case, these kinds of responses, they, I think they do make us cringe a little bit. So these are clearly negative interactions, and they are, although positive on the surface and maybe were meant to be as compliments by a speaker, by the responder, these are clearly microaggressions that can be offensive. So the conversational data, this conversational data is later used to train large conversational systems and other types of systems. So many systems in our field are trained on user-generated data. This data is collected at scale, and if we want to build large-scale, high-performing systems, there is no way for us that a trained human moderator will monitor every such conversation to decide whether this was a positive or negative interaction. And what it leads to is, as we saw in many examples, data that is generated by people is riddled with stereotypes that people have, with social stereotypes. By nature, by the way our brain is wired, we are all biased. And often we are not aware of our own biases. So occasionally, such models are taken into extreme and make big headings in news. They lead to unintended harms. So these are some examples. Some of them became already a cautionary tale, like Microsoft's Twitter bot tie that pickups on hate speech became racist and sexist overnight. There are other more recent examples like GPT-3, that a bot that was offering suicide advice. And just about 2 weeks ago, there were new headings about a Korean chatbot that had to be removed within a day or two because very quickly it became extremely homophobic. So this happens again and again. And why does it happen all the time? So there are several reasons. But I think the main reason is that today's language technologies take a very data-centric approach. So we need a lot of data to train good models, and we do know well how to leverage data, but language is produced by people. It is targeted towards people, about people, and people build models, and we don't take the people component into account in our modeling paradigms because we don't incorporate well pragmatics, we don't incorporate well social and cultural context. Then we use deep learning models that are really powerful. They are good at making generalizations, but our models don't know that some inductive biases are good and some inductive biases are not so good. This is just the type of knowledge that we do not incorporate in existing models. And further, these models are opaque and not interpretable. So it's also not easy to analyze what generalization they make. And it's not always easy to spot the problems before they propagate and to kind of address the larger audience of users. So this brings unintended harms that occasionally make big headings, but the problem is more broad, and it's not only about ethical NLP, it's about the way we do modeling today. So what I call the way we do modeling today, in particular in the context of computational ethics, is a reactive approach. So the way we deal with these kind of problems is that first we create technology that may unintentionally pick up on some problematic types of language or unintended biases through correlations in our training data, some spurious artifacts in the training data. Then we try to fix the models, but maybe this data has already appeared and kind of potentially harmed the users. And when we see these harms, we start debiasing models. We propose approaches to debias word embeddings. But it's not clear whether, for example, debiasing word embeddings ever helps to actually debias and the actual downstream systems. So basically, today we are not yet prepared to prevent this kind of harms rather than react to these harms after they have been made. So I think that an alternative and maybe longer term solution is to take a proactive approach, something that would go further up the pipeline before we train and deploy our models. And to be able to detect such problematic content and all types of, not only the examples that I showed before it appears, before it propagates into systems. But it requires some paradigm shifts in the way we analyze our data, in the data analysis tools that we have and we build, and also in the way we approach modeling. So in the way we represent social cultural knowledge, in the way we train models to incorporate this knowledge, and the way we evaluate models. So what are we missing today in our approaches to considerations to ethical NLP? For a proactive approach, first, what we are missing is data analytics tools. So today, analysis tools that analyze human conversation, they focus primarily on overt hate speech. We also have some sentiment analysis tools, but hate speech is only one subtype of negative communications. It tends to be explicit and profane or violent, and it is relatively easy to detect with lexicons. However, hate speech is not only about such toxic, extremely toxic interactions, and there is a large volumes of communication in which offense and toxicity is not in words. Like in the examples that I showed before, these examples are called microaggressions. And it is important to understand that microaggressions are ubiquitous on social media, in user-generated data, because these are just expressions of implicit bias. And it's important to understand that microaggressions are not correlated with sentiment. So as you see in these three examples, they can be tagged as positive, neutral, or negative sentiment, but they're usually offensive. And these are not overt hate speech examples. And there are plenty of social science studies that show that the microaggressions cause emotional harm, and they specifically target marginalized groups. Because they actually can be more harmful than overt hate speech, because they subtly reinforce problematic biases and stereotypes in data, in human communication, and consequently in our data. And as I mentioned before, today's state-of-the-art NLP tools just cannot recognize any type of microaggression. So this is class of solutions that we are missing fully. So hate speech detection would mark these as non-toxic, and sentiment analysis often can mark these as positive, thereby maybe even promoting this as a positive content. So the next class of solutions, the broad class of solutions that we are missing today in NLP is that we are not able to understand for the same type of comments whether they are positive or negative, depending on the context of the conversation and depending on our understanding of who are the people involved in the conversation and what is the cultural context of this conversation. So our understanding of social cultural norms and the way we represent knowledge of people and of social roles is practically absent. We don't incorporate context about people. Most of our approaches are fully data-driven, not people-driven. And further, this kind of lack of awareness about social context is present in our data in the form of spurious correlations. And we build deep learning models that are really, really good at picking up on spurious correlations. And this brings biases already into our models. And in this way, for example, and is in this example, just the same type of sentence, which includes maybe names from people of different races, would get a different label by a sentiment analysis task. So our models pick up on spurious correlations, which these signals correlate with our target labels because our data are biased, but are not true indicators of the target labels. And it's not yet clear how to demote spurious confounds in deep learning models. And finally, these models are black box. So at analysis time, it is very difficult to analyze why the model makes a mistake. And in the case of examples of microaggressions, as I've shown, it's actually very important to be able to also explain why the model makes specific prediction, just because these conversations, these compliments like the one here, you're pretty for your age, it is offensive, but the user might not be aware that this kind of conversation is offensive. So if we had good explainable models and we are able to generate explanations why this could be perceived as microaggression, this potentially creates a space for productive interventions, for actually helping users understand why this comment may be perceived as negative, even though they had good intent. So potentially explainability could actually bring positivity in the form of kind of interventions that we could make online. So to summarize this long introduction, here, these are suggested directions for a proactive approach, but these directions require a paradigm shift in the way we do data analytics and modeling beyond the field of ethical NLP. So these are just technical challenges that we have in deep learning, how to represent knowledge better, how to incorporate it into models, how to build explainable models. And these are, of course, not orthogonal research directions. They have to be intervened because, for example, for the first part, to enable some automatic moderation that is able to unveil social biases and conversations beyond overtly hateful speech, we do need to incorporate social cultural knowledge and be able to demote confounds and generate explanations. So these are kind of directions that are very closely intervened. So to summarize again this introduction, so we are basically, this pink box shows the kind of toolkit that we are still missing in NLP, which is a data analysis toolkit that can analyze who are the speakers in the conversation, potentially flag biases in the conversations, and also generate explanations. Today's tools cannot deal, neither hate speech detection nor sentiment analysis cannot deal with this kind of challenges. So what I'm going to present is 2 papers from my group that just scratch the surface of this ambition that I was talking about in the introduction. So these are 2 research projects which involve all these 4 dimensions that I mentioned. So we detect microaggressions through incorporating social contexts, through demoting spurious correlations, and then we build some tools for make these models more robust and also more interpretable. Both of these papers were presented at EMNLP last year. So I start with the first one, done my my PhD student Anjali Field, and it focuses on unsupervised detection of implicit gender bias in conversations. So we are aiming to capture subtle and implicit biases, the kind of biases that people might not know that they have. And a classic machine learning approach would be to scrape a bunch of data from some social media platform, send it to annotators, your favorite crowdsourcing platform, such as maybe Mechanical Turk, to annotate these comments for bias, and then build a supervised classifier. So this is a standard approach. However, this approach just cannot work in the case of subtle negativity and manifestations of gender bias. There are many reasons for this, but the couple reasons that I want to emphasize is first that how do we select comments for annotation? We don't have a good lexical seed. We cannot find, we don't have specific lexicons that could pre-select. So potentially there is many millions and billions of comments, and we don't know how to sample the right comments to even to start annotations. The second, and maybe more important, is that biases are subtle and implicit. And crucially, annotators, especially untrained annotators, might not be aware. They have their own biases, and they will incorporate these biases into annotations. So these annotations cannot be trusted. So what we do in this work, we developed an unsupervised approach that does not rely on human annotations. So here is a second suggestion. So we cannot build a classifier that directly predicts gender bias. How about we build a classifier in which we incorporate the context of the conversation, and we compare comments addressed towards men and towards women, and try to find significant difference in responses. So here the idea is that if we build a model that given a comment to a person can classify with high confidence that the comment is likely to be addressed towards a woman and very unlikely to be addressed towards a man, there is a good chance that this model, this comment may contain gender bias. So again, we build a classifier that given the comments to a person without looking at the original comment would predict the gender of the addressee. In principle, this could be a better direction than the previous one, directly predicting gender bias. First, our classification labels are more objective. So rather than predicting a subjective bias of label of bias, we predict a more objective label, which is predicting the gender of the addressee of the comment. And this model implements a more direct definition of gender bias. If we can predict the gender with high confidence, then the text is likely to contain gender-specific generalizations. However, as you see, I titled this slide "The Naive Approach," and you can probably guess there are some problems with this approach. Notably, comments to the addressee may contain language that is predictive of the gender of the addressee, but not necessarily indicative of bias. For example, a comment, "Pro golf is better" in the slide, it is clearly predictive of the gender of the addressee. It's a male, but it's not a sign of bias. It's just a gendered language. So the core technology behind our proposed model involves identifying the factors that are predictive of gender, but are not indicative of implicit bias. And then encouraging the classification model to ignore these factors, basically reducing the influence of confounds, of factors that are predictive of gender, but are not predictive of bias. So we treat these factors as confounds in our classification task. And we identify 3 categories of such factors. We call them observed confounds, something that we can observe and enumerate; latent confounds, something that is difficult to enumerate; and the just overt gendered signals, indicators such as the word bro, which are relatively easy to tackle. So I will next discuss each of these 3 factors and describe our methods to demote these confounds. After we demote these confounds, comments that are still predictive of gender, despite controlling for these confounds, are likely to contain implicit bias. So this is the main idea behind this method. So first, we focus on observed confounding variables. So again, we assume a setting where an addressee has written a text, such as a post on Facebook, and we aim to detect bias in comments replying to that original text. And obviously, the first factor we need to control for is just the context of the conversation, because the comments may contain reference to the original text. And we need to control for how gendered is the original post. So if the original post is gendered, or here is an example on the right, "Do I look okay? You are hot." So this response is appropriate. It is not, maybe it is not a sign of gender bias because of the original comment. So to identify language codes by original text and not the gender of the addressee, we resort to propensity matching. Propensity matching is a method drawn from causal inference studies. And we use propensity matching to balance the training data so that comments addressed towards men have similar distributions of original text values as comments addressed towards women. So we discard the training data that has heavily gendered original text in order to create a balanced data set. Then references to the original text are no longer use longer use predictors of gender, since they are no longer correlated with the gender in the training data. So this was about observed confounds. The second type of confounds that we want to control, and the first one again is about looking at the original, the context of the conversation on the original post, and trying to balance our training data so that the population of original posts produced by men and by female and women is pretty similar. So we, in the responses, we expect to have to pair comments with similar original post, but different responses. And if we find difference in these responses, it means already that likely the comment is predictive of the gender regardless of the context of the conversation. So this was the first method. The second method is controlling for latent confounds. So what are latent confounds, and things that we need to control for is, here is an example. So if an addressee is a man from Canada, and there is, and the comment would be, Canada's got no game. And if there are many comments referring to Canada in the comments of in the responses, the model might pick up on this curious correlation and learn that the word Canada correlates with the target gender. To generalize it, basically we need to control for the traits of people that are involved in the conversation. Traits of the addressee other than their gender. For example, their origin, that they are from Canada, or some other things, other common topics that they mention. It can be topics of the conversation, it can be personal traits. And we cannot use propensity matching for this, because that's only effective when confounding variables are known and observed. But we cannot possibly enumerate all possible traits of the addressee. And to demote latent confounds, we use adversarial learning approach that we introduced in another paper on a different downstream task. But this is a general method for representing and identifying variables which are latent confounds in text classification tasks. So again, these latent confounds that we name are topics and words that correlate with the target gender, target label, in this case, the gender of the addressee, but are not true indicators of the label. They are latent because they are not known a priori. To identify these confounds, we use first log odds with Dirichlet prior, which is a common way to identify words that are statistically overrepresented in a particular population compared to others. So we construct a vector, which is the distribution of latent confounds for each individual in the training data. These are latent properties of individuals in our training data. And then we train a classification model, which is a Y-shaped network. On one side, it predicts the gender of the addressee, but on the other side, it adversarially demotes the properties of the addressee other than gender. So in this way, we learn representations that are invariant to the confounding variables, encouraging the model not to learn features predictive of this vector of latent traits. So in this paper that reference here, we describe a novel approach, an adversarial training with multiple adversaries to make the model more stable, and the GAN-like objective to train the classifier. Again, in this way, we encourage the model to focus on signals that are predictive of women and men in general, rather than signals that are predictive of specific individuals in our training data, because we demote the properties of these individuals. And finally, the third category of confounds that we control for, these are just overtly gendered terms in comments. These can be names that can reveal gender. This can be titles like Mr., Miss. And what we do is we just identify them using simple heuristics and lexicons and name identity recognition, and replace them with more neutral language. So to summarize, we build a framework for detecting gender bias without explicit annotations of gender bias. We focus on text, targeting, and addressee. So this is a second-person language, and trying to predict the gender of the addressee while making the prediction problem hard by accounting for the context of the conversation, by developing a method to adversarially demote latent properties of people in the framework, properties which correlate with specific individuals and various social cultural signals, but not necessarily indicative of their gender. And overall, this is a causality framework that seeks to identify content that occurs because of the gender of the addressee rather than other factors. So here in this framework, we define a counterfactual. Would the addressee have received a different text if their gender would be different? So the evaluation task of such a framework is also a big challenge, because there is no gold standard annotated data for understanding and evaluating gender bias. So instead, we first evaluate how well we demote confounds, latent trait, how well we control for different populations in our propensity matching approach. And we see, and we basically evaluate it on held out data. And we see that our model performance improves on held out data because we demote spurious correlations. And also we see that word statistics before and after propensity matching create more balanced training data for words. Basically, demotes words that are very overtly original posts correlate with female topics versus male topics and other words. Next, we evaluate our model on the actual microaggressions. For this, we scrape a small corpus of like self-reported microaggressions from Tumblr. And we train our model on Facebook posts that address men and women. And in this way, so this is a public data set that we released a couple years ago. And so we train our data on kind of comments from Facebook, on comments to politicians or to famous actors and actresses. But then we evaluate our data on a totally different domain, on self-reported microaggressions that were discussed on Tumblr. And we see that despite being such kind of out of domain model, it captures signs of gender bias and kind of is able to identify gendered microaggressions significantly better than a random baseline. Finally, we analyze this model and the patterns it learns. In particular, we analyze words that most impact model confidence, and we compare posts surfaced by our model with prior work on gender stereotype. Do comments involve some words that are related to gender stereotypes? And what we find, for example, in Facebook comments addressed towards female politicians is that some high bias comments are likely to reference their families, spouses, their power and competence. In contrast, Facebook comments addressing public figures like actresses and tennis players are likely to primarily containing sexualized and objectifying language, words like beautiful, sexy, love, and so on. So this was the first part, the first paper. And in this first study, I described a fully unsupervised approach. We didn't have any labels of microaggressions or gender bias. In the next paper that I want to present, it's a different approach that asks, what if we had a small probing corpus of microaggressions? So just a small set up to 100 microaggressions. And we asked two questions. First, how can we make the classifier more robust given a small set of probing examples? And second, how can we make the classifier interpretable in the way it could generate explanations in addition to model predictions? And in this study, we don't develop a new model from scratch, but we start with an existing hate speech detector, in particular perspective API. And our goal is to make any detector of hate speech more robust, specifically to more subtle, more veiled manifestations of offenses. So we frame this problem as the problem of adversarial attacks on hate speech classifiers. Microaggressions is only one example of such adversarial examples. But there are many other types of veiled toxicity, for example, novel forms of hate speech and code words, which is a disguised hate speech when perpetrator specifically uses misspellings or code words not to have their comments filtered automatically. So why do toxicity classifiers fail on inputs with veiled toxicity? So first, the way training corpora are constructed, examples of toxicity are usually overt. And they are selected using some example profanity lexicons. So the toxic portion of the training data does not include usually microaggressions. Moreover, the way the positive subset, basically positive is not non-toxic, the non-toxic portion of the training data is constructed maybe through some random sample of benign data. So, for example, based on the absence of toxic lexicons, which means that non-toxic portion of training data is likely to include mislabeled instances like in the example on this slide, the input to the classifier. So how can we augment the training data with better examples and reliable mislabeled microaggressions? So basically remove microaggressions from, relabel them. So we need some automated way to analyze training data and surface misclassified examples. But there is another problem that we don't know how to interpret the classifier's decisions, specifically on veiled toxicity. In general, today, the popular approach to standard approach to analyze and interpret neural networks decisions, text classification, is to use something that is called saliency maps. So it's a general term for many different approaches that what they do is they identify which words in the input sentence are salient to model predictions. This can be based on attention or some gradient-based attribution, but overall, in the case of veiled toxicity, and this sentence, "You're so pretty for a black girl," the saliency maps are just not helpful because the toxicity is not on the word level. So it's not about the specific words in the input. It's about more broader context. So the crux of our model is that we propose to interpret deep learning classifiers' decisions by tracking model parameters and directions of gradients, and then tracking what training examples are influential to specific predictions. For each classification decision, we can sort the training corpus of a model by influential training examples. And if we have a microaggression as a probing example, we can use this analysis to surface similar microaggressions in the training data as influential examples to the decision of the classifier, even if these microaggressions are mislabeled by the model. But there is another problem. So training data from state-of-the-art. So basically what we want to do is to analyze training data. But training data from many state-of-the-art toxicity classifiers belongs to companies. So it's not easy to obtain the real examples of hate speech, although we have some, a lot kind of corpora for which we work in the field of NLP. So basically, very often original training data is private, as well as the original classifiers trained on it. So what we can do is to take online data, like Reddit or YouTube comments, and we can label this training data using the original classifier, which we assume is currently a black box. So we take Perspective API and the large unlabeled training data and unlabeled data from social media and just label this data using the classifier. And then we can train a student classifier. This student classifier is just, we can just use BERT-based embeddings and to train on this pseudo training data. And in our experiments, we show that we can pretty much mimic perfectly the Perspective API results. So overall, what we propose is an active learning setup that will search for such difficult examples to annotate. So given a very small set of adversarial examples, a small probing data P, we want the model to surface orders of magnitude more toxic examples, which will help us retrain the toxicity classifier and make it more robust. So given a small set of probing examples, we take the classifier, we interpret its decisions, we take top most influential examples in the training data to the decision of the classifier, and we can send them to expert annotators for relabeling, only top key examples. And as you might already see, the key part of this framework is how to define the influence metrics. This is a difficult part. Basically, how do we measure what are influential examples in the training data on the classification decision? And we explored several methods in this and in a previous ECL paper, which I describe very briefly. So basically what we define is a pairwise scoring function I between the training example and the probing example, each training example and the probing example. So what are possible methods to instantiate this I? So first and a simple one is straightforwardly measure embedding similarity. So many current neural models like BERT encode the input as some hidden representation and then project the label space. So we can take the hidden representation of the BERT encoder and measure how different are representations of the training examples and the probing examples. The second approach we can take is based on influence functions by Koch and Liang, 2017. So this is a different approach. So first, it measures if we upweight a training example by some small amount, some epsilon, how would the parameters of the potential classifier change? Then it measures that given the change in the potential classifier, how would the loss of the probing example change? And finally, we define the influence score as shown on this slide, implying that upweighting an influential training example should lead to a decrease in the loss on the probing example. So this is a method that traces the decision of the probing example back to the training examples. But you can see that it's extremely inefficient, very, very slow, because basically we need to upweight or downweight every training example in our data. So we were looking also for more, the benefit of influence functions is they're faithful. Basically, there is mathematical proofs that influential training examples are indeed the right examples. But because of the inefficiency, we were looking for other methods to experiment with, and this is one method amongst several that could be used. It's called the track-in method. So this third method computes the gradient product. And here is the simple intuition. So at each epoch I, the model would take a step along the gradient of the training example's loss. And we measure how much this change in the model parameters would potentially help decrease the probing loss by taking the dot product with the gradient of the probing loss. And then we aggregate through all the checkpoints of the model to get an approximation of the accumulated loss reduction for the probing example caused by the training example. So like influence functions, this is another way to understand how the decision of the probing example can be attributed to the training example. So overall, this is the overall framework. We take unlabeled data from social media. We annotate it using Perspective API. With this training data, we train a student classifier. Then we have a small set of probing examples. For each example, we track the influence of training data on this probing example, and we hope that the top surfaced examples, most influential examples, are actually target microaggressions that we could re-annotate. So how well does it work? A quickly experimental setup. So we take Twitter and Reddit data to train a student classifier. And we also use social bias inference corpus by Martin Saab et al., which have specifically multiple human annotations of whether this post can be offensive. With this training data, we have clean messages, non-offensive messages, overt offensive, so those messages that are tagged as toxic by Perspective API and also offensive by human annotators. And veiled offenses, such as microaggressions, those that are tagged as non-toxic by Perspective API, but offensive by some annotators. And we have held out test data, 1,000 of each of these three types. And our student classifier pretty much perfectly mimics the Perspective API classifier, having almost 100% of non-offensive accuracy on non-offensive test examples, over 97 on offensive, and only 1% accuracy on veiled offenses. And we have about 100 probing examples, which are again taken from microaggressions.com. And this is a visualization that shows distribution of each training example influence rank, specifically with track-in method. So basically, blue is veiled offenses, red is clean offenses, clean messages, and green is overt hate speech. And we do indeed confirm that the most influential training examples to probing examples are actually microaggressions that we could relabel. And we evaluate the model, basically what happens after one iteration that we re-annotate top 1,000 most influential examples and retrain the model. And what we see is for track-in method, if we fix, say, top 1,000 most influential examples, we almost keep the accuracy on hate speech. We lose a few percent of accuracy on clean offenses, on clean messages, not offensive messages. And the accuracy of detection, specifically of microaggressions, goes from 1% to 37%. So we see that both influence functions and gradient product outperform the baselines. But this is, again, very, very initial steps, and a lot more research is needed to understand basically how to do it. So to summarize, biases in data are pervasive and pernicious, and today our tools just cannot deal with these biases. And there are all kinds of modeling approaches that need to be changed to be able to create this new toolkit of social bias analysis, which would understand who are people involved in the conversation, which would generate explanations. And overall, what I presented is a very, very narrow subset of work on potential work on addressing social and ethical challenges for language technologies. And there are many more very interesting research directions, and I hope more people will be involved. And I want to thank my amazing students for this work, and I want to thank you for listening. And I didn't time, I hope I didn't go too much over time.
It's okay, Yulia. Thank you very much. This is very interesting and also nice to see that there are so many open questions to think about, maybe in the context of workshop. So other questions? I don't see questions for the moment. Maybe I can ask, in the meantime, one question we had on YouTube. In the first paper, you identified gender bias in text. However, there are surely biases that are harder to categorize and not even rejected by a majority of people. Where does data cleaning end?
So I didn't get the last sentence. So basically we identify gender bias, but there are many, many different biases that are not easy to fit into this framework.
It sounds like maybe there is a point that not fitting in the framework and maybe even not many people would necessarily agree or share and reject these biases. No.
Exactly. So the problem is classifying bias is that it's very subjective. Again, because we all are biased in our own ways. So this framework is one example of predicting a bias towards a particular social group. A similar framework could be built to identify comments that are predictive of other social labels, race, age, and so on. However, this is not a final framework, by no means, that I believe should be used to detect gender bias. It's just the first attempt because the problem is so difficult. And not only because we often don't have those target demographic labels, which also there is a question, where is this boundary between predicting this label, right? Having this framework that predicts this label and the privacy of the person, but also the whole space of intersectional biases. Like when we basically treat the person as a whole and not their category, and what happens kind of at the intersection of those labels. So potentially I do see how to extend this framework by moving away from a specific binary label, which is also wrong to use a binary label, but this is the data that we have. So moving away from the binary target label of the gender addressee to some latent representation of a persona, and which is not a true persona of a person, but like not true labels of a person, but the way this persona, their language is represented on the web. So some dynamic representation, latent representation of a persona. So this is how I can see to extend this framework. How to deal with the subjectivity of what is bias and what is not it's a huge question that like, we need to involve social psychologists to do proper training. So this is not something that I can suggest a solution for. But that's why basically for our evaluation, we primarily use the corpus of self-reported microaggressions. When people say like, I felt offended because of this sentence, this is something that we definitely know that this can be offensive to some people. But there is no way to construct an objective corpus of microaggressions.
Yeah, I think Irina has a question. Irina, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. Thanks for the great talk, Yulia. Social norms are dependent on culture and also on country. So do you think we can model social cultural contexts kind of in general, independent of the language?
I don't think we can model social cultural norms independent of a language. And moreover, I don't think we can model social and cultural norms independent of the people. So it's not only at the language level, it has to be somehow modeled, represented at specific population levels. I don't have really good solution on how to properly represent the knowledge of social and cultural norms and social roles. It's a huge research direction that we almost didn't work on.
Yeah, I guess how to create the relevant data would be a huge challenge.
Yeah, and there is all kinds of issues here with this, because basically what we would like to do is to build some huge repository database that would analyze what are possible social roles and what are power relationships between these social roles, and what is language that is associated, what are norms and the cultural norms, and this kind of framework. On one hand, it's important to have it. On the other hand, it's very dangerous also to build it. Like, there are many ways we can build it in a wrong way, because eventually what this data should do is reinforce on all kinds of stereotypes and like make us kind of analyze and summarize stereotypes that people have, that are stereotypes that are associated with culture and with specific social roles and with the language associated. So how do we build our representation understanding on social roles by not reinforcing stereotypes? It's, I think, a big future question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yulia, there is another question. I think it might be the last question we can take and before moving to breakout. So is there a chance to decide based on reaction reply in the conversation, basically use this as a source of supervision for the model? I think the question relates to the first part, because you always presented context before this utterance, but in principle, in reaction to this reply, the addressee of this reply is probably reacting differently depending if it's microaggression or not, right? Is there a way to exploit this information in modeling?
I'm not sure. Sorry, I kind of not sure I understood the first part. So,
so if you have this request to this utterance, which is potentially biased, right? If there is a microaggression, the person to whom it's addressed is potentially reacts in one way. If it's
oh, yeah.
So just kind of modeling the future using this feedback in the future.
I see. So actually, it's a good point, and I think like basically again emphasizing another drawback of our approach again, because it was just an initial study, that what we look is only the short context of the conversation, a sentence and a response. But what we should look at is a longer context of the conversation. And there is an interesting work, for example, by Chris Potts and his student on condescension. And actually the way they collect condescension data is by looking at the response of the person, and when the person says, oh, that was offensive, or this was condescending. And this is a good idea on how to kind of extend or build a new framework based on people's responses. However, this brings all kinds of interesting NLP challenges. For example, we need to understand the quotes. Basically, in this response, when the person says this was condescending, do this person responds to the previous post, or it's a context of the conversation that discusses a third person, for example? So there are all kinds of interesting and like problems in pragmatics to understand the to analyze properly the response to microaggressions, which I think is a super interesting direction for research.
Yes.
Thank you for these questions.
Thank you very much, Yulia. Let's everyone thank the speaker. It's a bit uncomfortable because we can't really clap, right? But yeah, this is
I cannot even see who attended, but thank you very much, everybody. Yeah. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Yulia. So now we move to the breakout session part. Irina already talked about breakout sessions in her opening talk, and you also received